After the destruction of Jerusalem in Namibia, the establishment of the fake Israel was created in the Middle East to hide and conceal the crimes that was committed in South Africa, and at the same time South Africa was in the apartheid era.
Arab states went to war with the Israelis after this. This is a big moment. 4 p.m., Rothschild Boulevard, David Ben-Gurion officially declaring Israel an independent state. The Jews finally have a home. His talk is pretty nationalistic and very thoughtful. He stresses on points like the state of Israel would strive to develop the land for the good of all its residents, be based upon foundations of liberty, justice, and peace, and that Israel would ensure social and political rights to all citizens without discrimination of religion, race, or sex. But did any of that happen? See, Palestine after World War I was under British control and was seeing a series of violent outbreaks between the Arabs and Jews. And to resolve that, the UN proposed a partition plan which would divide the land into 2 states, Jewish Israel and Arab Palestine, while keeping Jerusalem a UN-controlled international zone. The votes came in. 33 countries approved, 13 countries voted against it, while 10 completely abstained from voting. And although the Arab states walked out as a form of protest, the partition plan was adopted. On the ground, tensions were high, and they continued to escalate with the massacre at Deir Yassin. This started the mass exodus of Palestinians, while Jewish immigration, which was encouraged by the Zionists, was on the rise. The Arabs were becoming increasingly frustrated as the atrocities kept growing, and with the promise of an independent Arab state nowhere in sight, Israel officially declaring its independence triggered a tipping point. Arab forces from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq marched to Palestine. This was the first time the Arab League was formed. And for what? To protect Arab Palestine. To put it into context, the Arab states had just recently declared their own independence from colonial powers, so Arab nationalism was on the rise. And although Arab leaders agreed on the importance of forming a unified Palestinian state, their interests came first. Fawaz Gerges, a professor of international relations, mentioned this about the Egyptian and Jordanian kings, that they appeared to be more concerned about their respective strategic positions than that of Israel. And according to historian Avi Shlam, the conflict between the Jews and Arabs allowed for the emergence of special relations between the Zionists and Abdullah, who wanted to secure his plans to expand the borders of his country. Nevertheless, the armies of the Arab League launched an attack, and in just a few weeks, Israeli forces were surrounded, facing a possible defeat. That's when the UN intervened with a 4-week ceasefire, which worked in favor of Israel. Ignoring the UN arms embargo, Israel imported heavy armaments from Czechoslovakia and used the time to reorganize. This brings us to a turning point in the history of the war. As soon as the ceasefire was over, Israel launched a counter-offensive, occupying 2 strategic Arab towns which were allocated to Arab Palestine by the UN. 70,000 Palestinians who lived there were forced to flee. The Israelis closed in and continued occupying the areas allocated to the Palestinians. And the Arab armies were not as effective as they were in the first round of fighting. There was little coordination and virtually no cooperation, says Avi Shlam. The Arab states who were led by Egypt responded by announcing the establishment of a Gaza-based Palestinian government. But this was more of a strategic move by King Farouk to prevent King Abdullah's ambitions to expand his borders. Israel watched the Arab feud, all the while consolidating its own position. It began singling out Egyptian forces with an aerial campaign. Egypt appealed to its Arab allies for help, but its appeals fell on deaf ears. And Avi Shlam says that the Arab states were either afraid to intervene or did not wish to intervene. By the end of the year, the Egyptians were defeated in Gaza and could no longer support the dream of a unified Palestinian homeland. Desperate, Egypt turned to Britain for help to preserve its territorial integrity. An armistice was signed with Israel, and the other Arab states followed suit and signed separate bilateral agreements with Israel, who now was controlling 78% of the entire territory. This brings us to the end of the war. What did the First Arab-Israeli War bring? An Egyptian military presence in the Gaza Strip, and Jordan was gifted the West Bank as a token for its loyalty to Britain and the Zionists. Meanwhile, 700,000 Palestinians were driven out of their homeland. And the UN's two-state solution? Well, it never saw the light of day. It's been 70 years. The crisis of this catastrophe continues.
Meanwhile, where the real location of Jerusalem was located in Namibia, the country was under the occupation of Germany and white South Africans to conceal and hide the evidence, and to further push the agenda of the Zionist state of the fake Israel in the Middle East. Until 1948, the highest authority in the territory was the administrator of the territory, appointed by the South African government. Only white settlers were allowed to vote for the Legislative Assembly and local authorities. A resident commissioner and magistrates administered the local inhabitants, issuing directives to chiefs and headmen. 4 native commissioners exercised authority in Ovambaland. Black chiefs were treated as government agents who could be replaced or dismissed. Ovambaland was looked on as a labor reserve, and very little development was undertaken there. The greater part of the territory outside Ovambaland included white settlements and the mines. The Herero and Nama communities within this zone were allocated reserves. Expenditure on development of the reserves was curtailed in order to pressure the local people into seeking employment on white farms. This would develop contract labor and establish a migrant labor system similar to that of South Africa. One incident in particular served to draw international criticism to South Africa. In 1921, the Union administration became involved in the suppression of the Bondelsforts, who, although living on the borderlines of poverty, managed to retain their economic independence by hunting, using dogs. To break this activity, the tax on dogs was levied. In addition, their leader, Jacobus Christian, was arrested without proper cause.
Namibia's bitter 100-year struggle against colonial rule came to an end on 21 March 1990 when Sam Nujoma was sworn in as the first president of independent Namibia. As the co-founder and leader of the Southwest Africa's People's Organization, SWAPO, Sam Nujoma spearheaded the country's 30-year military and diplomatic campaign attacking South Africa's illegal presence in what was at the time called Southwest Africa. In the process, Sam Nujoma emerged as the personification of the Namibian independence struggle. It took many years of revolt and warfare for Namibia to gain its independence from South Africa, and during the years of revolt and warfare, between 20,000 and 25,000 people died. In this episode of African Biographics, we cover the story of Sam Nujoma, Namibia's first president, and how that country eventually achieved independence from South Africa. Namibia, which was called German Southwest Africa and then simply Southwest Africa, had been colonized by Imperial Germany during the scramble for Africa. Following the end of the First World War and under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany surrendered its colonies to the Allies, and in December of 1920, German Southwest Africa was entrusted to South Africa to administer on behalf of the newly formed League of Nations. South Africa was expected to have full administration and legislative control over the territory until the people of the country were ready to take this responsibility upon themselves. What then transpired was that South Africa administered the territory in the same way the main imperial powers, Britain and France, had treated their African colonies. After the Second World War, the League of Nations was transformed into the United Nations, but South Africa refused to place Southwest Africa under the United Nations or to recognize that the United Nations had jurisdiction on the territory. 1948 saw the National Party in South Africa successfully grab power, and saw the same apartheid laws that this regime effected in South Africa were also introduced in Southwest Africa. These laws prevented black Namibians from having any political rights, as well as restricted social and economic freedoms. In 1949, South Africa virtually incorporated Southwest Africa into the Union of South Africa as a fifth province, and the South African government simply stopped providing the United Nations with annual reports of its administration of the territory. This move was tantamount to annexation. Economic integration of Southwest Africa soon followed, and most of the country's wealth, which was derived from its vast mineral resources, was diverted to South Africa. It was these mineral resources that encouraged and motivated South Africa to try and hold on to the territory throughout the many years of revolution. Inevitably, Namibians, who had a long history of resisting colonialism, finally rebelled. On 10 December 1959, mass protests against apartheid were held in the capital, Windhoek. This is because in this instance, South Africa's officials tried to relocate the black population from the center of Windhoek into the township of Katutura, and so public discontent grew, spawning an open protest. During this demonstration, police opened fire on protesters. Several people were injured and some were tragically killed. This event signaled a major growth of nationalist opposition in Southwest Africa. Prior to this event, the Ovamboland People's Congress had been formed in 1957 in Cape Town, South Africa by Namibians working in South Africa. This organization was under the leadership of Andimba Toivo ya Toivo. The OPC hoped to abolish the South African pass system, which required black laborers to seek official permission.
The year May 26, 1948 marked a turning point in South Africa's history, which would lead to 46 years of National Party rule and ultimately change the trajectory of the country and its politics to this day. The elections represented a turning point in the country's approach to racial integration, with one of the key campaign issues having been the future of black-white relations in the country. On one side of the all-white election, the Herenigde Nasionale Party, the National Party HNP, under D.F. Malan, who had based their campaign on pandering to the fears of white voters, while the opposition United Party, under incumbent Jan Smuts, were in favor of a more gradual form of racial integration. Apartheid legislation, apartheid era, sign apartheid era, sign apartheid era, sign, part of an exhibition in the Apartheid Museum, Johannesburg, South Africa. Racial segregation, sanctioned by law, was widely practiced in South Africa before 1948. But when the National Party, led by Daniel F. Malan, gained office that year, it extended the policy and gave it the name apartheid. The implementation of apartheid, often called separate development since the 1960s, was made possible through the Population Registration Act of 1950, which classified all South Africans as either Bantu, all black Africans, colored, those of mixed race, or white. A fourth category, Asian, Indian, and Pakistani, was later added. One of the other most significant acts in terms of forming the basis of the apartheid system was the Group Areas Act of 1950. It established residential and business sections in urban areas for each race, and members of other races were barred from living, operating businesses, or owning land in them, which led to thousands of coloreds, blacks, and Indians being removed from areas classified for white occupation. In practice, this act, and two others in 1954 and 1955, which became known collectively as the Land Acts, completed a process that had begun with similar land acts adopted in 1913 and 1936. The end result was to set aside more than 80% of South Africa's land for the white minority. To help enforce the segregation of the races and prevent blacks from encroaching on white areas, the government strengthened the existing pass laws, which required non-whites to carry documents authorizing their presence in restricted areas.
Apartheid was a policy adopted in South Africa that discriminated between whites and non-whites. Apartheid was in effect from 1948 to 1994. After centuries of colonial occupation by the early 20th century, South Africa was an independent nation, inhabited by many different ethnic groups. Indigenous Africans were more than 70% of the population. Inhabitants of European descent were about 15%. The remaining people of Indian descent or mixed heritage were called colored under apartheid. The The doctrine of apartheid, or separateness, was developed in the 1940s and promoted by the National Party. The party was predominantly made of Afrikaners, descendants of Dutch colonialists who had come to South Africa in the 17th century. Apartheid was meant to ensure that whites and non-whites on the same territory lived in segregation. Architects of the strategy insisted that apartheid would ensure that different ethnicities could live in harmony and preserve their own traditions. Instead, the philosophy rationalized racial discrimination. Oppression was under international scrutiny. The United Nations pushed the South African government to abolish the practice and impose crippling economic sanctions. In 1990, South African President Frederick de Klerk began to rescind apartheid laws and to open talks with the black majority. He released Nelson Mandela, who immediately regained his place as a political leader. In 1993, Mandela and de Klerk were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1994, South Africa's blacks regained the right to vote. The ANC won in a landslide. Mandela defeated de Klerk to become South Africa's first black president.
In the meantime, the fake Israel signed a peace treaty, and at the same time, South Africa's apartheid was abolished in 1994. Now, can you see how all the dots are connecting if you can remember from the part 1 and part 2 of the true location of the real Jerusalem? The Jordan-Israel Peace Treaty was signed on October 26, 1994, at the southern border crossing of Wadi Araba. The treaty guaranteed Jordan the restoration of its occupied land, approximately 380 square kilometers, as well as an equitable share of water from the Yarmouk and Jordan rivers.
The extreme violence of the Palestinian uprising, known as the First Intifada, created such uncontrollable chaos in the West Bank between 1987 and 1993 that the Jordanian government no longer wanted the responsibility of controlling that territory. After losing the Arab-Israeli War in 1948, Jordan had seized the area known as Judea and Samaria, annexing it in 1950 and renaming it the West Bank. After the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel regained control of the West Bank, including the Jordan River Valley, a thin strip of territory that forms the border between Jordan to the east and Israel and the West Bank to the west. The Jordan River Valley provides Israel with strategic depth and is vital to ensuring Israel is not cut in half in a future military confrontation. In the years after the war, Jordan was locked in conflict with Israel over the right to claim the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria, where both Palestinians and Jewish families lived. In the aftermath of the Palestinian Liberation Organization's failure to maintain order, Jordan decided to distance itself from the unrest by relinquishing its claim to civil authority over more than 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank. While Jordan continued to be the only Arab country willing to grant citizenship to Palestinian refugees within its borders, those living in the West Bank could no longer claim Jordanian citizenship. After 27 years of hostility and conflict, Jordan's king decided to pursue permanent peace with Israel, and in October 1994, a lasting peace treaty was signed. Like the earlier treaty with Egypt, Israel's peace agreement with Jordan proved that Arabs and Jews could settle their differences when both sides are willing to make peace.
So the big question, or what happened to the people who occupied the real Jerusalem after the destruction by the Roman Empire? They were the black Hebrew race that was in the Atlantic slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, segment of the global slave trade that transported between 10 million and 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas from the 16th to the 19th century. It was the second of 3 stages of the so-called triangular trade in which arms, textiles, and wine were shipped from Europe to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Americas, and sugar and coffee from the Americas to Europe.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy.
Numbers involved in the Atlantic slave trade are truly staggering. From 1500 to 1880 CE, somewhere between 10 and 12 million African slaves were forcibly moved from Africa to the Americas, and about 15% of those people died during the journey.
The majority of enslaved Africans were taken from 6 primary regions: Senegambia, Sierra Leone and the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, also known as Congo and Angola. An estimated 12.4 million people were loaded onto slave ships and carried through what became known as the Middle Passage, which moved across the Atlantic and included many different destinations.
Once in the Americas, the surviving slaves were sold at a market very similar to the way cattle would be sold. After purchase, slave owners would often brand their new possession on the cheeks, again, just as they would do with cattle. The lives of slaves were dominated by work and terror.
The idea that I am not human, that I have no soul, that I am a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever, and no recourse. Nothing.
The history of humanity is filled with oppression, dominance, war, and slavery. Since the beginning of time, people in different parts of the world have forced their fellow humans into slavery. The tale of the Atlantic slave trade is the history of millions of Africans who were forced out of their communities by European slave traders and shipped across the Atlantic in conditions of great cruelty. When Portugal and Spain started conquering and establishing colonies in the New World in the early 1500s, they forcefully made the Indians work their plantations. However, European diseases and the violence of conquest led to the death of many of the Indian slaves. This led to a labor shortage in Europe and made the Europeans look towards Africa for a solution. As voyages to Africa progressed, and with many expeditions by Portuguese and Spanish explorers, Africa became a major source of supply of slaves to Europe. In the Spanish West Indies, as well as the Portuguese colonies in Brazil, the Indian slaves were gradually replaced by Africans. These Africans were stripped of their identity and occupation. To refer to them as just slaves is incorrect, because before being captured by the European, many of them were farmers, merchants, soldiers, musicians, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, and many more. They were husbands, fathers, wives, children, and mothers. They had origins and heritage, but when the Europeans came and took over their communities, they became captives and had to be boarded on large ships and taken to Europe. The European slavers dispersed them across the Americas and different parts of Europe. They were forced to lead lives under terrible conditions and face severe labor conditions. They were stripped and flogged and forced to work very long hours, often under terrible weather and health conditions. The transatlantic slave trade transported between 10 million and 12 million enslaved black Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. You might have heard of the triangular trade, right? And how Africa was a major part of this trade, although suffering economically, while the other two parts that made up the triangle enjoyed huge economic benefits. We'll get to that shortly. The first slave voyage from Africa to the Americas is believed to have sailed in 1526. But even before this period, Africans were bought as slaves directly from Europe, and even native inhabitants of America were also enslaved by European explorers. Before 1518, the Spanish monarchy didn't permit the transportation of African slaves from Africa, not due to a sense of moral value or humanity, but because they believed Africans were barbaric and that they would corrupt the European society and introduce pagan and non-Christian practices to the country. However, over the years, due to economic reasons, there was a U-turn in that decision, and on August 18, 1518, King Charles V granted a charter to Lorenzo de Goravade to transport 4,000 slaves directly from Africa to the Spanish-American colonies. Over time, King Charles changed the law established by his grandparents and then permitted slaves to be brought into Spanish colonies in America from Africa on the condition that they would be converted to Christianity during their voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. With this new decree in place, there was an explosion in the number of slaves moved from Africa to America. There was an immediate expansion of the slave trade in the Western Hemisphere. European slave traders gathered and imprisoned the enslaved at forts on the African coast, and then brought them to the Americas. Generally, the European slave traders did not participate in the raids because their life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa was less than a year due to the widespread malaria infection. So the majority of people that were transported in the transatlantic slave trade were people from Central and West Africa that were captured by other West Africans and sold to the Western European slave traders. The transatlantic slave trade was essential to the whole economics of the triangular trade route, and European colonies in America needed the supply of slaves for their plantations. Speaking of essential, it's essential for you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. They don't want us sharing stories like this, but we're going to continue anyway with your support. The triangular trade. Now, let's dive a little deeper into what the triangular trade route was all about. The triangular trade route is simply the trade structure that operated across the Atlantic region. This triangular trade route across the Atlantic took goods from Europe to Africa. Some of the goods taken to Africa include arms, textiles, and wine. On the other side of the triangle was the movement of African slaves to the Americas and the West Indies. The last side of the triangle was the movement of raw materials such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton produced on American plantations back to Europe. The triangle involved 3 continents, with Europe providing the capital, Africa providing the labor, and America providing the land and resources. There was always a supply to the European market. The story of the transatlantic slave trade involves the story of all people in the 3 continents, but most importantly, those involved in the Middle Passage voyage. The trade route that transported slaves is known as the Middle Passage. The voyage is often marked with a lot of difficulties and even death. Depending on the weather, the voyage could take about 3 to 6 months. The passage was so brutal that the ships not only lost the people being transported as slaves, but in some cases, the crew also lost their lives. The mortality rate for sailors on slave ships was approximately 20%. The ships had a particular design and varied in size and passenger capacity. The conditions of these ships were inhumane. The African slaves were locked up below the deck in cramped quarters and only had a little opportunity to be out in the sunlight, and they were forced to carry out certain enforced exercises in the form of dancing to ensure that they were healthy and in good posture when they get to Europe. Inside of these decks was sticky and filled with the stench of dirt, feces, and urine. Research published in 1794 estimated that a man inside the deck had just a space of 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches, and a woman had 5 feet by 1 foot 4 inches. The girls had 4 feet 6 inches by 1 foot. The air inside the deck was hot, stale, and filled with the incessant smell of dirt and human excreta. The slaves suffered from starvation and thirst, and only had 24 ounces of water every day, i.e. the equivalent of 2 12-ounce soda cans of fluid per day. Their major food was horse beans and rice. The captives were packed tightly in tiers below decks and were chained together, hands and feet. The voyage was characterized by many difficulties, and the captives were faced with issues that included epidemic diseases and attacks by pirates. They also experienced physical, sexual, and psychological abuse by slave traders and crewmen. An estimate by historians put it that between 15 and 25% of the enslaved Africans bound for the Americas died during this voyage.
So what does the Atlantic slave trade have to do with Israel, South Africa, and Namibia? It's because all these countries and people are connected in some way or the other, because the liars know how to manipulate and distorted the truth away from the original location and to form the fake Holy Land, the promised scam there in the Middle East. Now back to the matter at hand in the present time. What's been happening in Palestine, Israel, and South Africa?
On October 7, Palestinian militant group Hamas launched an attack on Israel. By land, by sea, and by air, it was the first time Hamas has directly invaded Israel. Some have described it as Israel's September 11 moment, the worst surprise attack in 50 years. Hamas attacked homes, civilians, a concert in Israel, more than 1,500 dead, thousands injured, and hundreds kidnapped. No one saw it coming. But at the same time, it was not exactly a surprise. The last time serious violence broke out was in 2021, but it was nothing like this. Israel has promised swift and furious retaliation, saying they will launch a, quote, complete siege on Gaza. The bombing has already begun.
Do you know anything about that? What can you report at this stage?
And a ground offensive could soon be launched. Urban warfare in one of the most densely populated places on Earth. As the situation unfolds, many want to know the context behind the war. The conflict between Israel and Palestine has raged on for generations. The fighting we have seen is over the same issues and hatred born of 100 years of struggle. So, how did it start? Well, after the Ottoman Empire was defeated in World War I, Britain took control of the area known as Palestine, a strip of land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. Back then, it was occupied by an Arab majority and a Jewish minority. The international community tasked Britain with setting up a, quote, national home for Jewish people in Palestine. But both the Jews and Arabs claimed that historical Palestine was their land. You can see how that will become an issue. From the 20s to the 40s, many Jewish people fled to Palestine to escape persecution and the atrocities of the Holocaust. But that only incited the Arab population living there. Violence between the Jews, Arabs and against the Brits escalated. So, in 1947, the United Nations voted for Palestine to be split into separate Jewish and Arab states. Jerusalem, a holy land for both, would become an international city. Jewish leaders embraced the plan, but the Arab leaders did not. So began a stalemate. In 1948, the Brits realised the problem couldn't be solved by them, so they left. And Jewish leaders declared the creation of the State of Israel, with the backing of then US President Harry Truman. This did not go down well with many Palestinians. A war broke out, with neighbouring Arab countries, including Jordan and Egypt, joining the fight, the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It was catastrophic for Palestinians. Hundreds of thousands fled. By the time fighting ended the following year, Israel controlled most of the land. Jordan, siding with the Palestinians, occupied land which became known as the West Bank, while Egypt occupied Gaza. Jerusalem was divided between Israeli forces in the west and Jordanian forces in the east. Crucially, there was never a peace agreement. Each side blamed the other. War would continue for decades. Fast forward to June 5, 1967, the beginning of the Six-Day War. Now, this is significant because the map was again redrawn. Israel captured and occupied the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and other Arab territories. The thing is, most Palestinian refugees and their descendants live in Gaza and the West Bank. Neither they nor their descendants have been allowed by Israel to return to their homes. Israel says this would overwhelm the country and threaten its existence as a Jewish state. Now, Israel still occupies the West Bank, and even though it pulled out of Gaza, the UN still recognises that land as occupied territory. Following? Okay, now let's look at Jerusalem. It's one of the holiest lands on earth for Christians, Jews and Muslims. Israel claims the whole city as its capital, but Palestine claims East Jerusalem is the capital of its future state. For the past 50 years, Israel has built settlements in Jerusalem. More than 600,000 Jews now live there, but the Palestinians say that's illegal under international law. There have been numerous attempts at peace over the decades, starting in 1979 and culminating in the 90s in Oslo. Palestinian and Israeli leaders met and negotiated a two-state solution. Initial promise and optimism gave way to anger and distrust, and by 2000, violence again erupted. By 2008, the prospects of peace had taken a severe hit. The most recent peace plan came from Donald Trump in January 2020. Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu said it was, quote, deal of the century, but the Palestinians scoffed at it, saying it was one-sided. So, tensions remained incredibly high, particularly in East Jerusalem, Gaza and the West Bank. Since 2007, Gaza has been ruled by a Palestinian militant group called Hamas, which has battled Israel countless times. Palestinians say they're suffering because of Israeli actions and restrictions. Israel says it's only acting to protect itself from Palestinian violence. It is endless. But things really kicked off in mid-April 2021, the start of the holy Muslim month of Ramadan. There were daily violent clashes between Israeli police and Palestinians, and scenes like this. Forced eviction of Palestinian families in East Jerusalem, which inflamed the situation. In the neighbourhood of Sheikh Jarrah, an Israeli man with a thick New York accent is filmed occupying the backyard of a Palestinian woman's home.
Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
it's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, ya ammi.
And then this. Israel unleashed devastating airstrikes on Gaza, while Hamas countered with hundreds of rockets fired back at Israel. As has so often been the case, conflicting claims over Jerusalem is at the emotional core of this conflict. Egypt and other surrounding nations tried to broker peace, but as always, for peace to be agreed, both sides need to resolve complex, deep-seated issues. And until that happens, it's hard to see an end to this endless conflict.
Everything is connected. Why is South Africa versus Israel? The proceedings instituted by South Africa against Israel on the 29th December 2023 before the International Court of Justice, ICJ, are officially referred to as application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel. South Africa's submission alleges that Israel has committed and is committing genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip in violation of the Genocide Convention and places the charges in what it describes as the broader context of Israel's conduct towards Palestinians, including what South Africa described as a 75-year apartheid, 56-year occupation, and 16-year blockade of the Strip. South Africa has requested that the ICJ render immediate provisional measures of protection by issuing an order to Israel to immediately suspend its military operations in and against Gaza. Israel's foreign ministry characterized South Africa's charges as baseless and further described South Africa as functioning as the legal arm of Hamas. Israel argues that it is conducting a war of self-defense in accordance with international law following the Hamas-led attacks on its territory on 7th of October 2023. Approximately 1,200 people, most of them civilians, were killed in these attacks. Israel points to ongoing firing of missiles at civilian population centers, the kidnapping and holding of Israeli hostages in Gaza, and contends that its war cabinet and military authorities' directives show no genocidal intent. While acknowledging the high incidence of civilian casualties, Israel attributes them to Hamas and other militant groups using civilian infrastructure as cover for their military assets and operations. Israel asserts compliance with international law and claims to facilitate humanitarian aid into the territory.
Which is one of the most densely populated places in the world, is home to approximately 2.3 million Palestinians, almost half of them children. For the past 96 days, Israel has subjected Gaza to what has been described as one of the heaviest conventional bombing campaigns in the history of modern warfare. Palestinians in Gaza are being killed by Israeli weaponry and bombs from air, land, and sea. They are also at immediate risk of death by starvation, dehydration, and disease as a result of the ongoing siege by Israel, the destruction of Palestinian towns, the insufficient aid being allowed through to the Palestinian population, and the impossibility of distributing this limited aid while bombs fall. This conduct renders essentials to life unobtainable. At this provisional measures stage, as this court has made clear in the Gambia-Myanmar case, it is not necessary for the court to come to a final view on the question of whether Israel's conduct constitutes genocide. it is necessary to establish only whether at least some of the acts alleged are capable of falling within the provisions of the Convention.
Israel has a genocidal intent against the Palestinians in Gaza. That is evident from the way in which Israel's military attack is being conducted, which has been described by Ms. Hassim SC. It is systematic in its character and form. The mass displacement of the population of Gaza, headed into areas where they continue to be killed, and the deliberate creation of conditions that, quote, lead to a slow death, unquote. There is also the clear pattern of conduct, the targeting of family homes and civilian infrastructure, laying waste to vast areas of Gaza, and the bombing, shelling, and sniping of men, women, and children where they stand, the destruction of the health infrastructure, and lack of access to humanitarian assistance.
Everything is connected. Here comes Namibia against Germany for backing Israel's genocide in Palestine. Remember in the part 1 and part 2 of the real location of Jerusalem, whereby we showed the map of the real Jerusalem in Namibia and South Africa. Now can you connect the dots and understand how South Africa and Namibia played a huge role in this Gaza and Palestine war?
Now, Bangladesh and Colombia have now joined South Africa in claiming that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. Namibia has also criticized Germany for supporting Israel in the genocide case at the International Court of Justice brought by South Africa. In its statement on X, Namibia accused its former colonial ruler, Germany, of committing the first genocide of the 20th century between 1904 and 1908. More than 70,000 indigenous Herero and Nama people were killed in the massacre. Namibia's president says Germany is ignoring the lessons of its past atrocities. He accused Berlin of supporting a genocide in Gaza while disregarding Israel's killing of Palestinians. Well, let's speak to Israel Kanoucheke about this. He's a Herero activist and a member of the Namibian NGO Alliance, No Amnesty on Genocide, joining us from Berlin. Thank you so much for your time. A pretty strong,
thank you for having me.
Yeah, a pretty strong reaction there from Namibia's president to Germany's decision to support Israel in the genocide case brought against it. First of all, for our international audience who may not be aware about the past, the history, the context, tell us more about why Namibia is challenging Germany so strongly, why you believe that Germany is not fit to tell what is genocide and what isn't genocide.
Yeah. Firstly, I just want to confirm that Namibia was the German colony, 1884 to 1915. So and secondly, this was the first century, the first 20th century genocide. It means that our land was occupied by the German Kaiser troops, military, confiscating our land. Forced labor, raping, and of course the first concentration camps in our country, former German Southwest Africa.
Yeah.
So the problem is that Germany is still not recognizing us officially as genocide, and we are demanding. We have 3 pillars. What we are demanding: apology. Recognition of genocide and reparation. And up to now, Germany is refusing all these 3 points.
My understanding was that, sorry to interrupt you, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding was that in 2018 they had apologized for the massacres and announced a scheme for reparations. Did that not happen?
Yeah. No, when you read the joint declaration, in this declaration, no word reparation is mentioned. No genocide is mentioned in this joint declaration. That's why we, as Herero organizations and the opposition parties in Namibia, we reject this joint declaration because they don't even mention the word reparation in this declaration.
Right. In
So
the
this is
statement
our-
that the president issued, he said that Namibia, the Namibian president said that not only Germany committed this first, what it says is the first genocide of the 20th century in Namibia, but that many of the horrific tactics which were used against the Herero were repeated later on during the Holocaust. Can you tell us a bit more about the Herero experience during those massacres? They died, I understand, in the most inhumane and brutal conditions.
Yeah, exactly. They died. Some of them, they have to flee the country to another country like Botswana. And as I said, many of them died in concentration camps. And of course, and today the Hereros and Namas, they are demanding their land back, which is still occupied by the German settlers. 60 to 70% of our land is still occupied by the Germans. This is our demands. We want our land back. We want reparation from Germany because of all these atrocities, what we call genocide. So these are the most important things that even we were not, the Hereros and the Namas were not involved in these negotiations in Berlin in 2015.
Yeah, and just coming
So
back
we
to the
demand-
case, you want reparations, and that's understandable. But just coming back to the case that's in front of the International Court of Justice right now on what's happening in Gaza, do you feel Germany's support to Israel's defense will carry weight? Will it make a difference for Israel, or will it hurt Israel?
Yeah, Germany is trying to dodge because they know if South Africa succeed in this case, so then the next is Germany, because we are going to sue Germany. We are not finished with Germany, so our solidarity is also with the Palestinian civilian in Gaza and the Palestinian people, because their land is occupied, and we had this experience of occupation and atrocities in German Southwest Africa. This is what our brothers in Palestine and Westland, are now experiencing. So this is our solidarity, and the government of Namibia is also supporting the South African step to this kind of to the case at the International Court of Justice.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you talking to us about this. Israel Kaunachi from the Namibian NGO Alliance No Amnesty on Genocide, joining us there from Berlin. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
After everything has been set and done, this is what is about to happen to the fake Israel in the Middle East.
Striking news. The whole world is watching. The course of human history is changed today.
This is not a test. This is an emergency broadcast transmission.
We're going to stay on the air for as long as possible.
We're seeing heavily armed forces being deployed.
Every man make himself and his country proud. Be brave! Be brave! Be brave!
We're under attack! What we just witnessed come out of the ocean.
12 different locations across the globe were breached.
There are massive casualties in Moscow, Paris. We've lost communications with Tokyo, Rio, and New York.
flag 1A, approaching left, ordnance live and loaded. Awaiting drop off position. Satellite 1A, we have remote launch authorization. 3, 2, 1, drop.
When all the liars and the deceivers are destroyed, this is when God the Messiah Yeshua will restore and bring back the diaspora back to his promised land.
Have you ever pondered about the journey of the Black Hebrews, tracing their roots back to South Africa? Could the land of the Zulu, Xhosa, and Sotho also be the promised land of a people dispersed far and wide? Let's embark on a journey through time, exploring a story rich in faith, resilience, and a quest for identity. In the 17th century, a great number of Africans were transported to the Americas under the horrendous conditions of the transatlantic slave trade. Among these were the Black Hebrews, a people who held fast to their unique religious and cultural identity despite the trials they faced. They held on to a prophecy that after 400 years of enslavement, they would return to their native land. This prophecy was not just a beacon of hope, but a compass guiding them through the dark times. The 20th century saw the rise of movements like the Black Hebrew Israelites in the United States. They asserted their identity as the true descendants of the ancient Israelites. This led to a renewed interest in their African roots. Fast forward to the early 21st century, a wave of Black Hebrews began their journey back to South Africa. They believe that South Africa, with its rich cultural heritage and diversity, is the long-awaited promised land. Their return has not been without challenges. There have been issues of acceptance both from the local communities and from other Jewish groups. Yet they remain undeterred, driven by faith and a sense of belonging. So what have we learned from this journey? The story of the Black Hebrews is a testament to the power of faith, the strength of identity, and the pull of one's roots. Despite centuries of hardship, they have held on to their belief and made a journey that few can imagine. Their story is a reminder that identity is not just about where you are now, but where you have come from. And sometimes, the journey back home can be the most significant journey of all. This tale of the Black Hebrews is a complex tapestry woven with threads of history, faith, and identity. It's a story that continues to unfold as they forge a new path in South Africa, the land they believe to be their promised land. In the grand scheme of things, it's not just about returning to a geographical location. It's about re-establishing connections, reclaiming identity, and rekindling a sense of belonging. It serves as a profound reminder. Home is not just a place, it's a feeling, a sense of belonging. And for the Black Hebrews, it's the fulfillment of a prophecy that has guided their journey for centuries.
What if we told you that the face of Jesus Christ, as we commonly know it today, may not be historically accurate? As we dive back into the annals of time, we encounter a millennium-long history of the depiction of Jesus Christ as a black man, a representation that holds profound significance in understanding the intersection of faith, race, and art. Our journey begins in the early Middle Ages, a time when the image of Christ was not yet standardized. The representation of Jesus Christ as a black man was prevalent in many parts of Europe and Africa. This depiction was not based on physical accuracy, but rather on the symbolism of color in medieval Christian art. The color black was often associated with humility, suffering, and the human condition, traits that were central to the portrayal of Christ's life and teachings. Advancing into the late Middle Ages, we find the Black Jesus Christ being venerated in various religious orders. The Order of the Black Madonna, for example, was a prominent group that worshipped the Black Jesus and Mary. Their devotion to the Black Christ was a testament to their belief in the universality of the Christian message, transcending racial and ethnic boundaries. As we step into the early modern era, we witness a shift in the depiction of Jesus Christ. The Black Jesus Christ became less common in art and literature, giving way to the more familiar Caucasian representation. This shift was largely influenced by the rise of colonialism and the desire to create a divine image that reflected the ruling class. But the Black Jesus Christ did not fade into obscurity. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the image resurfaced with the rise of Black liberation theology. This movement, rooted in the African American struggle for civil rights, reclaimed the Black Jesus Christ as a symbol of empowerment and resistance against oppression. The Black Jesus Christ was not just a religious icon, but a rallying cry for justice. Fast forward to the present day, and the Black Jesus Christ continues to hold relevance. In a world grappling with racial tensions and social inequalities, the Black Jesus Christ serves as a reminder of the inclusivity and universality of the Christian faith. It challenges us to confront our biases and to embrace a more diverse understanding of divinity. In closing, the Millennium of the Black Jesus Christ is a rich tapestry of history, art, and theology. From the early Middle Ages to the present, the image of a Black Jesus Christ has been a powerful symbol of humility, universality, and resistance. It has challenged and continues to challenge our perceptions of divinity, urging us to see beyond color and to recognize the inherent dignity of all humanity.